Well, I'm really tempted to spill over the discussion to the second part. But you see, we could not help but frame the discussion also within the context of the, shall we say, receding Western hegemony and the entry of the new powers. This is true for our discussion on the China Sea issues and relations in Asia and ASEAN. It is true also with what is happening now in Ukraine and Crimea. Yeah. Our guests also, of course, like me, follow the events all over the world. No? I'm sure it's very important for the Philippines to understand. My last discussion with Consul Annette Ablan was entitled Lessons of History from What is Going on in Ukraine. Because my sense is that the coup in Kiev was the same thing that happened in EDSA 1 here. It was IMF that took over the Yatsenyuk government now is a banker's government. Yatsenyuk is a banker. So austerity will follow and so on and so forth. These are the less discussed minutiae of what is going on in Ukraine. Agree or disagree? Please go ahead. And so what are the implications for the country, for the region, for the world? I framed the topic for this second part as BRICS versus West because I want BRICS to be constantly discussed. Because the Western powers, the U.S. keeps saying the international community support this new government in Kiev. But what about India, China, who have, although politically in the UN, been diplomatic and abstained, China abstained, but in their sentiment expressed in their print media, including the Indians, are really very supportive of the Russian position. And that is, BRICS is 40% of the world, and if you add their alliances, that might be 60-70% of the world, the real international community. So is this now, is the West now facing the challenges from BRICS?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think you have to view it in terms of big picture. We are now transitioning, or we are very much transitioning, from the unipolar world dominated by the U.S. after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what is happening, and from the point of view of the Chinese strategic planners, and the rise of China, of Chinese power, they saw this about 10 years ago, but it really became apparent to them, or they adjusted their policy in the light of the global financial crisis. And after that, they saw that the multipolar world, with a relative decline of the West and the relative rise of BRICS, to be something that they want to promote. And this is why they also became assertive with Chinese power and then Russian power. What is happening in Crimea, in Ukraine, is interesting, because you have the first redrawing of the political map since the post-Cold War era. So I think we're done with that post-Cold War. We're entering a new phase. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Cold War is back. I think what it means is that it is driven now not by Russian communism. It is driven by Russian nationalism.
That's right. Yeah.
So the periphery of Russia, like Crimea, this is one example where Russian pride, Russia is trying to win back its historic territory, its historic pride. From the point of view of the Chinese, of course they're very close to the Russians, but if they were to support the Russians openly, they lay themselves open to the possibility, if what Crimea did, have a referendum and join Russia, were to happen in Taiwan, there's no problem. But would they let a referendum happen in Tibet or Xinjiang and then lose this? No way. So that's why they have a sort of a mixed and wavering position, and it resulted in an abstention. But really, what you're seeing is really a change in the balance of global economic and political power, and we're seeing it in terms of the redrawing of the maps. Unfortunately, in the South China Sea and East China Sea, it's also manifested by the way the Chinese are trying to sort of recover what they consider lost territories.
Richard had an article in Al Jazeera. I just read it and I couldn't open it again to reference it while we're discussing. But what was it about?
No, it
It was
was really,
about the Ukraine, I
it
understand.
was
you know,
about the South China Sea disputes, but trying to draw some sort of parallels
That's
between
right.
what's
Yeah,
happening there
yeah,
and
yeah.
here. I mean, the fact that I think many in the Philippines are interested to see what happens there because we want to see if the U.S. and the West will help us if we face a similar problem.
Which the
with-
conclusion is right now.
I mean, the way you look at it is that the way that Putin talks about history is quite similar, eerily similar to how China talks about historical claims. But I more than history, obviously, if you talk to most Russians, they'll say that Crimea really is a Russian place. Of course, you talk to the Ottomans, they say, yes, 200 years
Yes,
ago.
yes, yes.
Yeah, but if
Of
you,
course, it's like the Israeli saying that
yeah,
Palestine is...
yeah, yeah. But if you look at it, most Russians will really, they really believe that this belongs to them. And if not for the Ukrainian Khrushchev in the 1950s, this would be still
By
part
the
of
way,
Russia.
I just read Solzhenitsyn quoted saying that before Khrushchev was Lenin's grant of several provinces to Ukraine to
Exactly.
entice Ukraine to join the Soviet Union.
So you have canons of even Russian literature and political, even political reformists from the past who believe that Crimea belongs to them. So Putin is playing on that. But I think this is basically a strategic game. And I was not completely surprised with what happened in Crimea, keeping in mind what happened in 2008 in Georgia.
Yeah.
So I think this is very clear for Putin. Yes, I accept that we suffered a temporary defeat in the 1990s. You humiliated us.
Yep.
You set us back. Yeltsin, his supposed mentor, betrayed the Russian interest by allowing the West to continuously expand into the post-Soviet
the
space.
fundamental point being raised by the Russians now is that there was a promise by the West to Gorbachev that they would not move east. NATO would not move east, and they've broken all those promises. Aside from all the fraud they exercised in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, and so on. I think the Russian position. I really reveled in the Russian response this time, and I really felt the same joy as the Russians did in rediscovering their national pride. Right?
Yeah, I think this is definitely strategic. So in 2008, they made it very clear, and this was even under Medvedev, the so-called reformist guy who's actually just a winger of Mr. Putin, that they will not accept it anymore. The idea of Georgia and Ukraine joining the NATO was a big no. It was a red line. So I
It's
think
just
Putin,
like the barbarians at your gate. Are you going to open it? No, you close it.
yes, I think Putin felt that, okay, I thought you got the message, and then now you have, okay, this will be my argument. There was an element of spontaneity to anti-Yanukovych kind of, protest in Maidan. It is true. But as any spontaneous event, you will always have the hardliners trying to take advantage of it. So on one hand, the pro-Yanukovych guy...
Hardliner for the neo-Nazis who were carrying
Yeah,
guns
exactly.
is quite an understatement.
So you have hardliners on both sides trying to take advantage of the situation. And the fact of the matter is that if you talk to any sensible strategist, Henry Kissinger, Mearsheimer, all of them are saying that Ukraine should have been a buffer zone. It should still be a buffer zone and should never be part of the NATO.
You did not include Brzezinski, is he? Anyway.
Yeah, well, Brzezinski, Poland and all, he's different. But if you look at the all sensible strategists who do not have a grudge against Russia, they would say that Ukraine should remain a buffer zone. And the biggest mistake was that Europeans and the Americans openly took side with the opposition against Yanukovych, and that for them undermined the late February deal. There was a deal in late February that Yanukovych will be given a little of immunity. There will be a unity government. Let's push aside the hardliners, and then the whole deal was scuppered, and the hardliners took advantage of it. And this is the biggest mistake of the interim government in Ukraine. They gave a perfect pretext by Russia, first by flirting with the idea, the Ukrainian parliament, that the Russian language should be removed as an official language. You go to eastern Ukraine, they don't speak Ukrainian. They only speak Russian, I mean, most of them. It was ridiculous. The second thing is that the interim government openly accepted some of the hardliners, according to Russians, the Neonazis, some of them, as part of the interim government. That was a big no-no. It was two mistakes for me. Gave a perfect pretext for Russia to come in.
I think it really reveals a lot of things under the slip to name the neo-Nazis and Svoboda, the right sector, into the defense and interior ministries. What does that mean? If you are Russian and you're looking at that, you are arming the neo-Nazis who killed, participated in the killing of 27 million Russians in the Second World War. So let us not forget the issue of the snipers, which was the trigger for the violent assault against the Yanukovych government. The snipers, the Estonian minister had to admit to Catherine Ashton of the EU that the opposition seems to have been the one who used those snipers to shoot at both. And that is repeated in Venezuela before, in the coup against Hugo Chavez.
Chavez, yeah.
This is CIA operation one way or the other.
This is part of the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, that's why
happening all over.
I always have to frame everything with the history of U.S. Subversion. I remember reading 20 years ago, my first realization that the U.S. policy is not diplomacy, but subversion. Subversion as foreign policy. This was a very significant book for me. And that was what the Americans did in Chile against Pinochet, in Indonesia against Sukarno, using the Philippine Mindanao as a base for bombing Sukarno's forces, and so on. So to bring it back to the question, is this going to be a West versus BRICS, and isn't this good? This resurgence of Russia and China asserting its, I call it a defense perimeter expansion into the first island chain and the second island chain, and the U.S. being forced to move more of its forces back to Guam and so on, for the multipolar world that you started. No?
I think, though, you should look at it as a historical process. The phase we just completed from 1989 or 1991 up to recent years. It's like a period of 20, 25 years. So this could take another 20, 30 years, the formation of a real multipolar
Just
world.
about the time when we leave everything behind.
But what's happening is that
Richard will have 20 more years.
instead of just one overwhelming, dominant superpower, the U.S. is still a superpower, but you now have several major powers.
Which is happy
big
development.
powers. And so you have China,
let's not
Russia,
forget Iran
India,
also.
Iran, and the regional powers, the middle powers. So what you're going to have is the distribution of power is less, less unequal, so to speak, compared to before. But the Russians, the rise of Russian power is that we've witnessed now. The only thing they have to watch is that we see the impotence of the West. No? They cannot move. And to a certain extent, Russia taking over Crimea, are you going to have a war with Russia over this, where there are more Russians there?
I don't think there will
be. If the Russians, though, miscalculate and go and try for eastern Ukraine or beyond that, then you may have a clash of
I think
power.
if there are referenda conducted in
Eastern.
Donetsk,
that one is possible.
Odessa, and several other provinces, the referenda will win. But I think that is a leverage for
Russia.
Putin to negotiate
Putin,
this buffer zone.
In other words, I guess the point I'm making is that we may see this back and forth between the West and the other rising powers, between the U.S. and the other rising powers. In the Asia-Pacific region, we're already seeing that the rise of Chinese naval and maritime power is starting to challenge American naval and naval dominance of the South China Sea, East China Sea. And I think the Chinese are not yet ready to dominate their so-called near seas, but they would certainly want a share. They would certainly want to be able to match or
I think the
challenge
Chinese
the
strategy is just to lead to a standoff with the U.S. In the first and second island chain, and that's enough for them.
Yes, but I don't think the U.S. will give in so easily, and this is where the possibility of conflict
Well,
will
looking
happen.
at U.S. Military discussion, they are in a quandary whether littoral, what do they call that again? Offshore
Littoral.
versus littoral A2, AD.
Anti-access area.
Yeah.
Anti-access.
They haven't resolved what will work against China at this
They have
point.
air-sea battle doctrine.
Yeah, air-sea battle doctrine and so
Air-sea
on.
battle.
They have not. They're in the midst of transition in their doctrine. So.
Because the air-sea battle, if they were to use that, it could really lead to a nuclear
That's right.
escalation.
That's right.
I mean, you're you're going to hit the Chinese command and control centers
That's
and
right.
even land troops,
Yeah.
the Chinese will, of course,
Yeah.
fire back as to defend themselves.
That's why the
And
other
it
strategy,
escalates.
the other doctrine being promoted is the offshore, meaning
Offshore.
cut them off here
Cut
at
them
Malacca
off.
Straits
Yes.
and so on. Yeah.
It's sort of block them off.
Yeah. Richard?
Let me unpack a little bit what's happening. Of course, it's a little bit convenient for us to see a West versus BRICS, I mean the leading emerging markets against each other. That is true, but only to a certain degree. If you look at it, even within the West and the BRICS, there are a lot of divisions.
Yeah.
You talk to any Russian strategist, he'll say that the real threat is not really Europe or the United States. The real threat
China.
is China because you have 40 million Chinese on the borders in Siberia. You have like few million
That's right, that's right.
there. So 56 years down the road, you will basically have a de facto Chinese occupation
We're
there.
not around anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where all of the natural resources, the oil and gas
there.
of Russia
That's
is there.
right, that's
So
right.
Putin knows that. I think the
That's right,
strategists
yeah.
know that. This short-term frictions with the West for them is temporary. The real battle is really with China.
That's right.
And I think the Indians also share the same anxieties towards the Chinese. Well, Brazilians have the convenience of geography. But if you look at it, you also on the part of the West, you have a division. President Obama, given the United States very minimal trade with both Russia and Ukraine, had the luxury to play it hard on
That's
them.
right.
Why?
That's
Especially because you have a bunch of Republicans going on the Fox News and saying, look at Putin, he's tough and
He's
muscular.
weak,
Look at Obama, he's weak and emaciated. So they put pressure on Obama to talk tough, and they talk tough. But the
Yeah.
problem is that automatically when he pressured the Europeans to impose sanctions on Russia, the Germans and the British said, we are not sure about
Yeah.
that. We have
Yeah.
tremendous investments there. Russia provides 1/5 of our natural gas and oil. There's just no way for us to escalate
What
it right
about
away
the
there.
possible,
So there was a division within the West.
What about the possible blowback from the EU against the US for this pressuring of the EU to go against its own economic interest in sanctioning Russia?
I mean, the thing is that the decline of United States relative power, well, the U.S. economy is actually getting back a little bit, but in the relative terms, the decline
We
of the
can have a
United
debate on that.
Yeah. Well, the decline of the United States in relative terms has provided an opening for other countries to challenge it. So you have China in East Asia, you have Iran in the Middle East, and then you have Russia in the post-Soviet space. That's true. But at the same time, it also created a lot of anxieties within the transatlantic alliance. So increasingly, the Germans are saying, by the way, we are the one taking care of the European Union. Where was the United States in all of this? Even in security and military terms, the Europeans are thinking increasingly, we have to think in our own terms. Because the United States, I mean, there were even, gossips that, you have princelings in UK and Europe saying to the Americans, the problem with you Americans is that you don't understand geography. So their idea with the Americans is that, they're stuck in the Cold
That's right,
War.
that's
They
right.
have the convenience of distance.
That's right.
It's easy for them to play hard. But we Europeans, we will be neighbors of Russia.
That's
We
right.
have been their neighbors and will forever be their neighbors. That's why there's a clear, divide in terms of strategic posturing. But now that U.S. is actually also getting weaker, it makes it easier for some Europeans to openly say actually no to the Americans. So even the transatlantic alliance actually is also in jeopardy here. Ukraine, I think, but the second part that I want to say is this. It is perhaps correct that Russia and China have legitimate grievances against against the West. My problem is this. When they try to correct historical grievances, it comes at the expense of a third group, which is basically Philippines, Ukraine.
Yes,
the
small.
weak, small developing countries who have been victims of historical movements. That is where I do not agree with the position of China and Russia. You may be correct in terms of your grievances against the West, but make sure that us, which did nothing to you in our history, will not be a victim of that. And that is where my sympathy lies.
But my reaction is, we have been victims of the hegemony over the past at least 50 years, but even 100 years. But let me just say, we're into our last 4 minutes. Why am I feeling so good about things? As I recall Mao's quote from Mao, there is turmoil under the heavens. The situation is excellent for a Cold War or for peace. I think it is also excellent for peace. As you say, the multipolar world will give birth to a more harmonious world. But go ahead, Chito.
Well, the hope is that you would have like a concert of powers, that you would have a sort of a balance of power. And I mean, it's so that there will be not one dominant power that we have experienced. I mean, it just won't exist after a certain period of time. I mean, it may take 20 or 30 years, but that's the trend. That's what's going to happen. The problem is how not to make it just a big power game. Where will a small country, a country like us with weak military power and weak economic power, position ourselves to advance our own national interests. Right now, our policy really is to lean on one side, meaning with the
US,
US.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have to develop a broader strategy. Okay, maintain our traditional alliance with the US,
Yeah.
develop relations with Japan, with India, but we should try to have a multi-directional,
Why don't we all,
including China. Even though we're having problems with China, it should not mean that we freeze everything.
yeah.
with
Chito,
China.
why not also include more active participation of the Philippines in NAM, National
Non-aligned movement.
Non-aligned movement,
Non-aligned movement.
and
Well, actually, we
and the BRICS
the BRICS
consensus,
well,
yeah.
because we actually should be part of the BRICS,
Yeah,
but we're
we
not
should
up
be.
to that in terms of power. You know, it's the bigger.
it
But we
really-
start. What we do is we align with ASEAN, and hopefully through ASEAN, make our voices heard, because that's how you project yourself.
Okay.
But actually, right now, we actually, because of the economic resurgence of the Philippines, and because of the political situation, we're attracting international. We're punching above our weight, so to speak. And if with the right tactics and strategy, I think we could punch even.
Okay,
in a bigger
Richard,
way.
we're nearing the end.
I mean, the message I think is very clear. The world is no longer predictable. There are seismic shifts in how the world operates, and we no longer can rely on the United States or a set of powers to tell us what should happen. So you cannot have U.S. snapping its finger, everything happens. What does that mean? The implication is very clear. We need a heterodox, creative kind of foreign policy. We don't have it now, but I'm sure after the next elections, we may have a president that is much more pragmatic and much more creative in its foreign policy. So the necessity is there. I hope we follow through with that.
Chito, you are engaged with some of our members of the Department of Foreign Affairs, policymakers and so on. Do you think they have discussions as we do, or it's too homogeneous?
Well, I do think there are a number of very experienced and talented people in the DFA, and they have all this discussion. The only problem, of course, in any government service, not only in DFA, is when the top leadership has determined the position, and if you want to be a maverick and question that, just be prepared, you won't be promoted.
It's like King Soreta, Ambassador King Soreta being kicked out of the
Exactly.
negotiations
Panel,
panel.
yeah, exactly.
Well, we'll continue with this. A month later again, maybe we'll get together again and update the public on these issues. Maraming salamat po and have a good weekend. So, short and bitin ng konti. So, it's good enough for the next time.
There's no way we can.
He's the head of FSI right now.
Ah,
That's
yeah,
his
yeah,
post.